Heintz, welcome to Kosovo. Can you tell me first, you represent an organization known for philanthropy, Rockefeller Brothers Fund. How did it come to the fact that first, how did Rockefeller family start making that money, and then why did they decide to give the money away?
Well, John D. Rockefeller himself, who created the Standard Oil Company, in which he made a vast fortune on the oil business, started work when he was 16 years old in the middle of the 1850s. And in his very first year of work, he made $45, and he gave away $5 in philanthropy. Because he had been brought up in a very religious family, it was a Baptist family, and in the religious faith that he practiced, giving to charity was a very important part of religious values.
What year was this?
This was about 1855. So he made $45 and he gave away more than 10% of his income. And it was fascinating. We have his original ledger book, his original accounts that he kept in his own handwriting, very small handwriting, in a little leather-bound book. And on one column is his income, and on the other page are all the things that he spent money on, including his first charitable gifts. So it was part of his values. And when he made his vast wealth, then, 40 years, 50 years later, he was the richest man in the world around the time of 1900 and was vastly, vastly rich. And
how did Rockefellers make the most of money? Was it all by good deeds and good business? How did they make the money?
I don't think that's a fair description. I think he was a very smart businessman, and he had enough foresight to see that energy was going to be an extremely strategically important business. So he started buying up all the different aspects of energy. So he bought oil fields, he bought companies to transport the oil, he bought railroads, he bought the refineries. He had this notion of a vertical chain of business. And he was ruthless. He was tough. He wanted to wipe out his competitors, and was really brutal, in fact. So there was this kind of almost schizophrenia, very tough business, and very generous philanthropy. And I think part of it was out of a sense of obligation and responsibility, and maybe even some feelings of guilt.
Do you think he paid taxes, all taxes in the beginning?
No, I don't think he did pay all taxes in the beginning. And in fact, it was in part because of John D. Rockefeller and how wealthy he became that the United States adopted an income tax. They didn't even have an income tax in the early part of the 20th century. I think it was 1911 that we finally adopted an income tax, and it was in part because he made so much money.
And how did he resort to the fact he gave, until then he had given tax as philanthropy, but was it easy for him to give money to the state?
Well, he, in the beginning, I think he, like many wealthy people in the United States, resisted the notion of taxing. But I think that he ultimately became comfortable with it as long as it was more or less done on a fair basis. If everybody was being taxed fairly, then he was prepared to do it.
And how was the foundation finally in 1954, as I know, 1945, after the Second World War, the foundation was established. From what money was it established, and what was its mandate to do?
So you think of John D. Rockefeller as the first generation in this story. The second generation was his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and he and his father created the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913 with John D. Rockefeller's wealth. He gave hundreds of millions of dollars to create the Rockefeller Foundation, which is still a large and important foundation.
What did they initially used to give money to?
Well, their original focus, John D. Rockefeller was very strategic. So he didn't want to give money to relieve a problem. He wanted to give money to solve problems. So, for example, he was very concerned about health care. And instead of just giving money to provide health services to poor people, he gave money for research to try to eliminate the disease. So there was a major disease in America in those days called ringworm, which affected rural populations quite severely. And instead of just treating the people who were suffering with ringworm, he created a medical body that did the research and created the cure for ringworm. So it was that kind of thing. So our foundation was then the third generation, and it was started by the grandchildren of John D. Rockefeller in 1940.
Could it be that one of the family, didn't anybody in the family turn out a black sheep not to want to give money to philanthropy?
Well, there have been some members of the family who have been more generous than others, and over the years, the family doesn't have as much wealth because they gave most of it away. John D. Rockefeller himself and his son gave away much of the family's wealth to foundations and to other philanthropic causes. And some family members have been very successful in business. David Rockefeller, who was one of our founders and is now 95 years old, was the head of the Chase Bank for many years, and he made a lot of money and gave a lot of his money away. But other members of the family are professors and doctors and leaders in civil society, and they don't make that much money, but they still are very generous.
How did this money start sipping into Kosovo, and when did you start doing this? Simply helping many projects in Kosovo. When did this happen and why?
Well, I was very active in Central Europe in the years 20 years ago, immediately after the Berlin Wall came down and the revolution spread through Central Europe. So the foundation was very active there in trying to help consolidate democracy, support the transition to market democracy, and to strengthen indigenous civil society. And I was working in the region at that time. When I came to the foundation in 2001, I came here after a very deep and profound experience in the Balkans during the very painful years at the end of Milosevic's rule in Serbia. And so when I started at the foundation, the very first decision I asked the board of directors to make was to support work here in the Western Balkans, because I see it as a very important part of Europe. It is Europe's unfinished story, and we need to do everything we can to help this region develop in peace and prosperity and in tolerance and in democracy. So we started working in Serbia and Montenegro and Kosovo in the early part of this decade, 2001 to 2003, and it's been growing ever since.
And Western Balkans is one of your pivotal places that you call together with some regions in the world. How committed are you to how long you think you'll be committed to Western Balkans? And what do you need to see happening here before you decide, well, the Western Balkans can do it on its own without our help?
Well, we take the long view, because the kinds of problems or challenges we want to work on are things that don't get solved overnight. So we are interested in being very careful about the places we select to work in, and then sticking with it for a good period of time. So I would expect that we would be here in the Western Balkans at least 10 years, and maybe longer than that. Now, the kinds of things we will look at before we make an exit from this region are European integration. That would be a major step forward. The development of indigenous philanthropy, so that civil society has local sources of support and our philanthropic dollars are not as necessary as they are today. That would be an important indicator. And, you know, a kind of long period of peace and prosperity where you see kind of normalization of society. These would be the kinds of things we'd be looking for.
Let's talk about European integration you just mentioned. Kosovo is likely to be the last one on the list and has to pass serious, very serious challenges to ever get to European integration, not to mention the fact that it's not recognized by some EU countries. Isn't that task just at the moment quite impossible to achieve?
Well, I wouldn't say impossible. I would say it's going to take a lot of hard work. And fortunately, you know, as I said, I worked in Central Europe, and I remember in 1999, officials of the European Union coming to Prague, which is where I was living, and saying the same thing. Don't count on ever joining the European. Some of them would say, don't count on ever joining the European Union. Others would say, it's going to be a very, very long time before, you know, Poland or the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Hungary are going to be ready for joining the European Union. And a lot of hard work had to be done, but it all worked out. And now they're all part of the European Union, and it's
Do you see
been
the
a good
same
story.
enthusiasm in Europe to work with all countries of Western Balkans?
I think there's some European enlargement fatigue. I think that it's a very complex process of creating a structure that now has 27 member states and might grow to, you know, something closer to 30. It's very complex, and we can see that.
What would you say that Kosovars could be doing that are not doing? What is in our own power that we're not doing? Such maybe recognitions are not in our power, but what are we not doing?
Well,
serious, to be considered serious partners for EU integration?
I think that establishing the rule of law and really building effective, transparent, and accountable institutions of governance are the two key things. And if Kosovo really worked on those two issues and made substantial progress in the years coming ahead, I think this would really advance Kosovo's status in Europe.
But to that question, recently with our latest EU progress report, our government replied to that criticism that's actually the EU lex a part of administration. The rule of law falls into EU lex. Do you buy that?
Not ultimately, I don't. You know, I think that ultimately what Kosovo wants to do is to demonstrate that Kosovar institutions are capable of managing the rule of law and the administration of justice and governance, and not rely on international institutions. This transition period, it's very important to have the international community here to support Kosovo. But my philosophy is Kosovo should do absolutely everything it possibly can, and the international community should only perform those duties that Kosovar institutions are not yet capable of performing.
Then can you be sincere with us and tell us, you've been coming to Kosovo for quite a lot of years now. Can you list for us what do you see having progressed, and what do you see, actually, be honest about, what do you see having regressed in Kosovo?
Well, I see pretty good progress on the kind of structural issues and process issues. So you now have, you know, pretty good elections. Not perfect. The recent local elections, municipal elections, were pretty well managed. There were some irregularities, and we've noted that, but they were pretty good. You now have a parliament in place. You have a constitution that meets, you know, kind of European standards of constitutions. So you've got a lot of the basics in place, and you have freedom of expression. You have a very vibrant media, and these things are all a part of the equation. But frankly, they're in a way the easy work. The harder work is to create a really vibrant culture of democracy. Democracy is not just about institutions and process. It's a way of thinking and behaving. It's a set of values, and that takes more time. And I think that is an area where there hasn't been as much development, and that's something that is of concern.
Can you be more specific than that?
Well, I think a culture of democracy doesn't have tolerance for corruption. A strong culture of democracy does not have tolerance for violence in society. A strong culture of democracy is about rights of all and the access of all citizens to the institutions of governance. It's about openness and transparency, and we just haven't seen enough of those things developing in Kosovo yet.
Can we now pass to, you came to Kosovo and you just did a lecture on Islam and democracy. Very interesting, you had dealing with an interesting question, can Islam and democracy coexist? You said yes, but could you elaborate a little bit more on realities of this world? In reality, in real politics, can Islam and democracy, what are the examples we're seeing in the world that it can exist in practice, not only in theory?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, of course, there are Muslim populations all across the globe. So there are Muslims in America, and they participate fully in our public life. And we have Muslims who are members of Congress and in state government and, you know, throughout the bureaucracy. So we're an example ourselves. But then there are even Muslim majority countries where you have strong forms of democracy, like Indonesia is, I think, a very good example. Jordan is another Arab Muslim majority country that I think is making progress in developing democratic institutions and a democratic culture.
Would you say America is an example of how to deal with the Muslim population and Muslim perception of Muslims?
In some ways, I think it is. There have been some very interesting studies done, scholarly studies, about the Muslims in America versus Muslims in other non-Muslim majority societies. And one of the things these studies point out is that there is a higher degree of integration, and that Muslims in America feel more part of the overall society and less excluded from all of the institutions and dimensions of society.
But what do you say to the world who has the world that has seen the last decade maybe a little bit of Americans bombing more Muslim countries or Muslims? That would be a very simplistic way of putting it, but the pre-Obama administration was seen like that. So
no, that's right.
While you're saying this, at the same time, can you admit to mistakes? First, here it's not about admittance, but there's very little criticism allowed of America because of how much America has done for Kosovo. We feel that saying anything critical about America would be really unthankful, ungrateful. But as an American yourself, would you admit to mistakes? Would there mistakes made in the way you dealt with the Muslims?
Oh, I think there were some very fundamental mistakes that have been made, and I would encourage all of my Kosovar friends. I appreciate that that Kosovars have gratitude to the United States, but you should stand up and criticize us when you think we deserve it, and that's part of the healthy democratic debate. I think we made a fundamental mistake deciding that the response to 9/11 was to be a quote-unquote war on terror, because I think that's the wrong metaphor to even use. War, if you think of this as a war, then you only think of military solutions. And that's primarily what we've been doing. And as you said, bombing is one aspect of that. But we've sent troops into Muslim countries. We've prosecuted a war. And this has left many Muslims thinking that actually America is conducting some kind of a war against Islam as a faith, which is completely wrong, but it does create that perception. I think what we should be doing is working to develop a much deeper level of understanding and respect between the communities of Muslims around the world and the United States and other Western countries.
Can you explain to us how does a democracy, such a strong democracy like America, deal with this conscience? Basically, something like when the mistakes started coming out in public, like the Abu Ghraib pictures, Guantanamo. How is the society itself looking itself in the mirror and correcting these mistakes? Is that happening?
I think that it is happening. I think that the election itself was a reflection of that. I think that one of the really marvelous qualities about democracy is that it is a self-correcting mechanism. If the people come to the conclusion that their government is not serving their interests, they can change the government. And that's what happened in the United States.
But what has happened to Guantanamo?
Well, Guantanamo is slowly being closed, and slower than I would like to see it be closed. But it's also very complicated to try to figure out where to send I think it's 276
It's easy maybe to speak
detainees.
now with the Obama administration, but where were the voices, and were there critical voices in America itself during the time this was happening? I'm asking this because I remember in this program we have a particular interesting history with this, because the only program that was ever stopped, a Life in Kosovo program that was ever stopped, was the time when we wanted to show Road to Guantanamo film here, and our colleagues in RTK just we couldn't agree among ourselves that this was proper. They thought
because it was too anti-American?
Too anti-American, and you cannot show a film like that if America itself hasn't admitted to the mistake. Then they'll start being critical when America itself starts being critical to itself. Now, that debate was impossible in Kosovo, but was it possible in America at the time that Guantanamo was happening?
It was. It was. And I think one of the healthy things, although it was very painful, was that film was shown in America. And it stimulated a lot of debate. And many people disagreed with it. Others, agreed with it. And it stimulated a very big debate that is part of the reason why our policy is now changing. And the release of the photographs about Abu Ghraib was a profound and disturbing moment that really led ultimately, I think, in large measure, to the fact that Donald Rumsfeld, who had been Secretary of Defense during the time that those atrocities occurred, was not reappointed in the second Bush term. So it had a very direct effect. And these things were debated very rigorously, very energetically in America at the time.
Was your media critical enough at the time?
Well, some of it was and some of it wasn't, but that's the way media is everywhere, I think. Certainly there was a lot of criticism.
Were you happy with the amount that there was and wasn't? Do you remember the time?
I generally feel like there was a good amount of debate and a good amount of discussion and a lot of information that was being made available to the American public by the media, not originally by the government, because the government tried to withhold the information, but the media forced the information into the daylight, which is where it needs to be.
And what would you say to those, for example, those critics here in Kosovo that defended the ban on the film being shown here, even though we advertised it and lots of viewers were looking forward to see it. They said this film would, in Kosovo, maybe affect the Muslim population that would be outraged seeing how American troops behaved in Guantanamo. And we don't want to encourage that. So do you think there's a tendency of radicalization of Islamists generally, and we have to work for that not to happen as media?
Well, there is still a very, very small percentage of Muslims around the world who are extremists or who engage in violence. A very, very small percent. It's less than 1%, according to some statistical analysis. Less than 1% of Muslims around the world even support this kind of extremist violence. So it's a very small group. Now, we have seen how very bad policy decisions can increase tensions and increase anti-Americanism among Muslims and others around the world. And this happened. You know, I think people really were shocked and offended by what happened at Abu Ghraib and what happened at Guantanamo. And this did lose friends for America. There's no question about it. But that's why it was important to get it out into the public so America could stop doing these things that were weakening our position around the world.
We're talking about America, but actually, while you're dealing with the problem, us in Europe, even before 9/11, there was a big debate about accepting or not Turkey into the EU, Turkey being of majority Muslim population.
Right.
So Europe has made its mind up at the moment, it looks, especially with a Swiss decision to ban minarets in Switzerland. It has made its mind up what it wants Europe to be. It doesn't want Europe to be Islamic.
I think it's still a debate. I don't think the debate is over. I was disappointed to see this decision of the parliament in Switzerland. I think it was a mistake to ban minarets. I think this is what creates tension. It doesn't reduce tension. But, you know, Islam, for example, is the second largest religion now in France. So Islam is in Europe, and it will always be in Europe. And I think those who want to turn their backs on this are making a very serious mistake. And I think Turkey's candidacy for EU membership should be viewed the same as anybody else's. If they apply for membership and they ultimately meet the standard criteria for EU membership, then their application ought to be considered.
But the polls show that the public in Europe is, to a larger extent, resistant of having Turkey in Europe. What do you say to politicians who say, well, we have to reflect the wishes of our, if you may say so, conservative population in Europe, maybe?
Well, I think it's a question of politics or leadership. And politicians have to be a bit of both. Obviously, in a democracy, they have to ultimately be responsive to the citizenry. But they also need to show leadership. And part of their function is to help educate the public. And what we need to combat is judgments being made out of fear, which is what is happening with regard to a lot of the issues around Islam or Muslims. People are using fear as a way of dividing society, and I think that's very dangerous. You've seen what that can do here in the Balkans. When people use fear for political ends, it can be very, very dangerous.
And fear is what's driving many people here, in particular, being by in any way identify itself as Muslims. For example, what would you say to what's happening in Kosovo is a little bit of a denial, complete denial of Islamic identity. Albanians present themselves as ideally as completely non-religious as possible, secular, in order not to be liked, not to be hated or disliked by Europe, because they see how Muslims are treated in the world, to the extent that, maybe, imagine, today, in the center of Pristina, we are building a new cathedral with 0.2% of Catholics in our city.
Right.
But while the Islamic community is saying we want new mosques because we have people who are praying in the street, we want new mosques, but the leadership is just too scared to allow them to build a mosque anywhere in the center. Maybe it will allow them somewhere in the outskirts. But what do you say to this position of the somehow a weak and young country that just sees the world in simplistic view, in a sense that how the world sees the Muslims, which is largely simplistic, and as you say, with minarets, it's just proven. Even a more progressive country like Switzerland decided that it doesn't want minarets. So Kosovars want to improve their chances with the West and just simply do everything possible to suck up to the West in a sense of building a cathedral when we hardly have a Catholic population.
Well, it's too bad if people feel like they have to hide their national identity or their ethnic identity or their religious identity. And in fact, I think it's a mistake. I think that one of the great things about Kosovo is that it is a Muslim majority country. It is a very secular country. Religion is generally separate from governance and politics, which is very healthy. So I think there's a good story to be told about Kosovo, a story about how Islam and democracy can coexist. And
but if the trend is more Islamization, our leaders, same in Switzerland, don't want this to be seen.
Yeah, but the trend of more Islamization is being exaggerated, and that's the mistake. And the truth is that we are creating tensions where we need not create them. And I really think we need to reject this approach.
If we need to reject this approach, then how would you explain the American policy in Palestine? You talked about it in your talk today. In Palestine versus Israel, Kosovo was in a good position that it was a Muslim, majority Muslim population helped by America, but real politics prevails in Middle East where a large population of Muslim population is not helped in intervention, no matter what human rights violations are done. So how would you explain this?
Well, I think, first of all, that resolving the Palestinian question is one of the most important foreign policy challenges in front of the Obama administration. And they need to be working on this energetically and consistently and over time, because it is not going to be solved easily. But if we don't create a viable two-state solution and give the Palestinians a secure and stable society for themselves alongside a stable and secure Israel, we will continue to have problems that ricochet throughout the Middle East and elsewhere around the world.
And how happy are you with the commitment that Obama administration has put into resolving this conflict? And what do you see having showing some progress, and what do you see not happening?
Well, I'm very pleased about the commitment to working on this. President Obama has made this a priority from the very beginning. He, in one of his very early appointments, designated Senator Mitchell to be his special envoy to the region. They've been working very, very hard, and I'm really impressed with how much work they've been doing, because this is an issue that requires an awful lot of effort. On the other hand, they haven't made a lot of progress yet, and I think that's disappointing. I think that President Obama has indicated a very different approach to Middle East peace than his predecessors by taking a tougher approach to Israel, and especially on the issue of the building of Israeli settlements.
But the Israelis didn't listen to
The Israelis
Obama.
have not responded yet, and they have not, changed their policy.
So I'm very curious to know what happens when Obama the president said that he wants a certain way for the settlements to be treated and for Israel to behave a certain way. Israel didn't approve yet, didn't approve. What happens when a friend doesn't listen to America? What happens when a friend like Israel didn't listen?
Well, they have to keep talking, and that's what's going on. We can't force Israel to do this. Israel is a sovereign state and will make its own judgments. What we can do is to try to persuade Israel to do this, and we can use all of the measures available to us for that, including trying to create the conditions in which it will be easier for Israel to stop building the settlements. But it's gotten to be very difficult as a result of the changed policy. President Obama is the most unpopular American president in Israel in many, many years. I think his approval rating in Israel now is at 4%. So this makes it very tough, but it also shows how much different his approach is than his predecessors.
I have to ask you please to explain for our audience the historical moment which you said today is going to happen in America with a health reform. What is happening with health reform in America? Why is it so important for your country?
Well, it's an embarrassment to me that America is the only really advanced industrialized democracy in the world that does not have a healthcare system that provides basic health services to all of its citizens. And so this is an issue that is about fairness, it's about equity, and it's about compassion. And so it is a historic process because we have tried in the Clinton administration to reform the healthcare system.
So let me just be clear about this. So poor people didn't have health care. Only the people who could afford and be rich had health care.
Well, or those whose employers offered health care as part of their compensation. So they would buy health insurance for their employees as part of their compensation. But if you didn't have an employer who bought health care, or you didn't have money yourself to buy health insurance, you were without insurance. And this is just an unacceptable situation. So President Obama has made this his #1 domestic priority, and it's been very rigorous debate in the United States Congress on this issue, but they're making progress, and it's very difficult, but they're going to get this done.
So what will happen with this reform? Who will get health service now?
Well, if the legislation is finally passed, which I think it will be sometime either before the end of this year or very early in 2010, then almost every American will have access to basic medical care. And they will either, there will be incentives for employers to buy more insurance. There will also be subsidies for people who have to buy insurance themselves so that they have access to insurance. And the insurers will be required to provide the health insurance even if people have pre-existing medical conditions that currently make them ineligible.
Can you explain for us in Europe, or just generally from European perspective of viewing things, it's not clear why could there be such resistance at all to making this health reform? Isn't healthcare good for everybody? Why could someone object that?
You would think so. Well, the big debate.
Why would there be resistance to it?
The big debate in America is that for some politicians and some American citizens, they see government involvement in the healthcare system as a form of socialism, and socialism has a very bad reputation in America. We are, after all, the nation that really rests its economy on capitalism, and so there's a really strong resistance, which I happen to think is wrong. But there's a really strong resistance to having the government involved in something like healthcare. And we even saw in the debates citizens standing up and screaming at their members of Congress saying, I don't want the government involved in my healthcare, which is shocking to me because it just seems, to me, it's a basic right.
But what were they saying to people that don't have the money to pay for it, don't want the government involved, and you can die as far as we're concerned?
You either, you make it on your own or it's too bad.
Final questions will be about the environment. I'm very interested to know about what you're doing about that. That will be our final question after the break. Të kthehemi pas pauzës së marketingut.
Nuk ka shumë rëndësi se nga niseni, por ku shkoni dhe çfarë mund të arrini. Ne e dim shumë mirë këtë dhe mund që përkrajmë të fitoni çdo sfidë. Jeto më mirë. Raiffeisen Bank.
Për ata që duan të rriten. Për ata që duan më shumë energji. Për ata që duan jetë të shëndosh. Prej gjeneratës në gjeneratë. Qumshti Vita, burimi i jetës.
Cilësia e pranuar ndërkombëtarisht.
apart from lots of work you've done on policy issues and reforming not only us, the Kosovans and the Western Balkans, but Americans as well, you've been doing serious work on climate change. Now, Copenhagen conference is just happening. Can you explain as well for an audience like Kosovans who are just becoming a country, is this something, an overwhelming reforms and things we have to do for our nation building? Why would this be important for us too? What could Kosovo get out of the Copenhagen conference, and what we could look at there for us?
Well, global warming is the issue that really proves the phenomenon of global interdependence. We only have one environment and one atmosphere, and whether you breathe the air in Kosovo or you breathe the air in New York, you're breathing the same air that is now filled with carbon, and it's not good for our health, it's not good for the environment, and ultimately it could have really disastrous consequences for the planet unless the global community comes together and really resolves to solve this problem.
What are you expecting they will do in Copenhagen?
Well, unfortunately, what they won't do in Copenhagen is achieve a legally binding international treaty that will commit all of the countries of the world to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This is disappointing because we need action urgently. What they will do, though, I think, is to come to a political framework which will not have legally binding character of an international treaty yet, but will commit the nations of the world to levels of greenhouse gas emission reductions that will help us move forward and set the context for the legal agreement, which then they probably will develop sometime during 2010.
Isn't this a pretty horrific future to look at when you think of how serious the problem of climate change is? And yet countries, even maybe countries like yours, America, will not commit to a legally binding document about how much carbon dioxide they will emit. I mean, how serious will the problem have to get for all the countries to legally bind themselves with?
Well, that's exactly the point. I do think there's some good news here, which is that the issue of climate change is now acknowledged by most governments around the world as a very serious and important issue, whereas 10 years ago there were lots of governments and lots of leaders who were essentially denying that climate change was even happening. So this is progress. And it will be. If we don't tackle this problem, by the middle of this century, this will be a very different planet, and it will not be a healthy one, and it will not be a safe one, because we will see rising temperatures, we will see water shortages, we will see food scarcity, we will see hundreds of millions of refugees who have to leave low-lying areas that are going to be underwater, moving into higher areas, and this will cause security problems. So the really negative vision of what might happen if we do not act is very, very serious indeed. I think people are finally getting to understand this, and governments are beginning to act. We're seeing progress. I just wish it would happen more quickly. And
isn't it just a little bit surreal that Rockefeller started it off with oil, energy, railroads, industrialists building a better life. Better life was always meant using coal and oil and railroads. And now you're working on reversing all that what the predecessors did.
That's right. The Rockefellers made their wealth by creating the high carbon economy, and we're now using their wealth in philanthropy to try to create the low carbon economy. And
tell me exactly what you're doing. Tell me some of your projects where you think you are lessening the carbon in the world, the carbon dioxide.
Well, we've done a lot of work on research. So we've sponsored and funded a lot of scientific research to document how serious the problem is, because that was the first step that was necessary. Then we've been funding a lot of work on the solutions. What can you do to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how can you start to implement those solutions that are available today, while you're also doing the research and development on the technologies and solutions that we're going to need 10 and 20 years from now. We're working to try to get U.S. policy, because as you indicated, if the U.S. doesn't act, why should other countries in the world act? We're the biggest, or until recently, we were the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have a huge responsibility for being a part of the solution. So we have been doing a lot of advocacy work, public education, working with the Obama administration to try to move the U.S. on this issue. And finally, we're doing a lot of work in China, which is the other big emitter in the world, and we're doing much the same kind of work there, working with the government, working with the advocacy community, doing the research and demonstrating how you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in practice.
But are you? I hear that you're doing similar things in the Balkans as well. What are you doing regarding the environment in the Balkans?
Well, we're just kind of getting started on this in the beginning. We are helping to fund the research on how much carbon is emitted here and what happens to the carbon that is emitted. And we're trying to build public awareness of this issue and also to start to talk to policymakers about the kinds of steps they need to be thinking about, for example, as they privatize the energy industry in Kosovo. How can they do this in a way that ultimately leads to a greener form of energy production in this country?
Kosovo is sitting on coal. What would you say to Kosovans who say, look, if you guys are still producing carbon dioxide, shouldn't you give us a break and let us run for a few years, get rich with this coal we're sitting on, and then when we can afford it, we'll be climate change sensitive? What would you say to Kosovans who think, we need to have our break with the coal?
Well, I think that ultimately we all need to have a break with coal, and the United States is still using a lot of coal. China is using coal for 70% of its energy, and we all have to have a break with coal until we can develop the technologies to really produce coal in a clean way. And we can improve the environmental qualities of coal, but we can't yet produce it in a way that doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions. But coal will be with us for a long time. So the question is building the alternatives, and that includes nuclear, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, all the other sources of power, and doing this in a way that shares the technologies with countries like Kosovo that are still developing.
But to be honest with you, sitting on coal hasn't done us so far much good. We
Right.
started off the project and it failed. We thought that a lot of people would be interested in our coal because of energy interest in the world, but that hasn't happened. What do you advise Kosovans? Our initial tender for building up a new power plant, which we need so desperately because we can't even offer the investor full 24-hour electricity, hasn't worked.
Right.
I mean, what are we doing wrong?
Well, I think it's time for a fairly radical rethink of Kosovo's energy future and to try to reduce the dependence on coal. You're also importing coal, even though you have all this coal in the ground. The coal you have in the ground is only useful in certain applications and not for other industrial applications, so you're importing coal from elsewhere. And I think it's time to think very differently about Kosovo's energy future and to invest in the clean and new technologies. This can be a source of new jobs, it can be a source of clean energy.
Can you explain a little bit what you're talking about? What is this new jobs and new technologies? What are the new technologies?
Well, you should see the wind farms that are being built in China as China tries to reduce its dependency on coal. They're building huge wind farms and huge solar cells. They're now the world's leading producer of solar cells. And so they're actually finding economic benefit in all of this, and they're going to be exporting.
Do they cost a lot of money to build?
They do cost a lot of money to build, and that's part of what will be debated in Copenhagen in the next days, is how much are the wealthy developed countries willing to finance of this kind of development in the developing countries, and this will be a part of the outcome of the international negotiation.
On the other hand, if we think of countries like people, in a sense that we talk about how we'd like to reduce it, but as people, me and you, we like to travel on a plane.
Right.
We'd like a clean environment, but we'll always opt, instead of taking a ship for you to come from America to Kosovo, I'm sure you didn't take an 18-day voyage on the sea, but you came with a plane. If people like you and me are not going to make different decisions, why should we expect the countries to make different decisions?
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. We're all going to have to make different decisions. We're going to have to make different decisions as consumers. We're going to have to make different decisions as citizens. And we're going to have to make different decisions as sovereign states. And that's part of the challenge of this problem, is that it requires, in fact, a new level of human consciousness to understand more deeply our relationship as human beings with this
Mr. Heintz,
planet.
are we ever going to be at the state we're going to give up flying? Can you ever imagine giving
No.
up flying?
I don't think we'll give up flying, but I think we will make flying more energy efficient and less carbon producing, and that will help a lot.
Is that happening already? Do you
It's
see that
beginning to
happening?
happen. Oh yeah, if you look at the quality of jet engines today versus the quality of jet engines 10 years ago, the efficiency has improved very, very significantly.
Thank you very much. But finally, I would like to for us to go back just to the fact of I would like you to talk a little bit about how American policy is in the Balkans for the next decade. How important will you talked about the challenges of global warming, of Islam, challenges of Middle East, and the wars America is finishing up in the Middle East. Where does the Western Balkans and Kosovo fit in this list of priorities?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's a long list of very, very difficult issues that the United States needs to address. But I'm pleased to say that in the Obama administration, there is still a great deal of interest in the Balkans, and people have joined the administration in senior positions who worked in the Clinton administration during the time of the war and understand how important it is to help finish this project of making the Western Balkans a stable, peaceful, democratic space in Europe. So I think it's going to remain on the agenda. I think that ultimately everybody would like to see this come off the agenda. Everybody would like to see the Western Balkans complete this journey into a zone of peace and stability.
The policy has been very well accepted here, the change of policy and administration as well, but nevertheless, has the American policy remained the same regarding the Balkans? And what I mean by that is, despite for the good things that America has done, it has been criticized for caring too much, firstly and lastly, about stability. That for the sake of stability, lots of other things can be nice. You can close the eyes on other things if Kosovo is stable. Mm-hmm. Do you support this type of policy?
No, I think we need a more nuanced approach, which is stability just for the sake of stability is not enough. What we want to see is stability in the international context, and we want to see dynamism in the national context. So what do I mean by that? What we don't want to see, obviously, are any more wars in the Balkans. We have seen the tragedy of that far too much. So that's the stability we want to achieve, is the kind of regional and international stability.
Let me take an example.
Yeah.
Is this stability for you when you see, or have you talked to American diplomats or just White House officials when the crisis of whether our government was falling and the coalition was breaking? How was that seen in Washington? Did people look into that with worry or with, oh, democracy is happening?
More the latter, actually, and I was very pleased to see that. More people were saying, well, it's a democratic country, there are political contests, and as long as the process occurs in a constitutional fashion that is transparent and open, then that's what happens in democracy.
It was anti-constitutional, what the government was trying to do.
And that's why in the end they pulled back actually from that process.
But actually Americans had to remind them it was anti-constitutional.
Well, and this was a good thing, you know, and this was a very good thing. But the Americans
Shouldn't the Americans let us fail? If you want us to mature, shouldn't you occasionally, like in this occasion, let us actually fail?
No, I don't think that's the right approach. I think the right approach is to say, if you want to change your government, that's up to you. If you're unhappy with the current coalition and you want a different coalition, that's up to you. But we were very much involved in helping you develop and adopt your constitution. We believe in it. And if we think that the process that you're using to change your government is against the Constitution, we will express that view, and then you decide what to do.
But that's still treating us as children, and we're behaving as one maybe, but treating us as people who don't know our own Constitution. We needed our dear American friends to remind us the Constitution we voted for. Isn't that a bit embarrassing?
Well, it's unfortunate, but that's the way politics develops.
And it's normal to have always your bigger friend, your bigger brother, always protect you. And when you know that, you're never going to stand up for yourself.
Well, I think there can be a situation of prolonged dependency which would not be healthy. And I think that ultimately Kosovars and Kosovar institutions need to stand on their own 2 feet and carry forward the business of developing this
Do
country.
you see that happening? I was present at a dinner where a government representative said to you, but we have no civil society. You talked about how civil society should breathe and develop and everything, but you were told there's no civil society in Kosovo. Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe that. I know for a fact that there is civil society and really remarkable institutions and leaders of civil society. It's still very young, it's still fragile, it's nascent, but it is developing, and that is absolutely critical for the health and vibrancy of this society going forward.
What should the civil society do? You support a lot of civil society here. What I just talked to you about progresses, asked you about progresses and regresses of the government of Kosovo maybe, but what can you see the progress and regresses of civil society that you yourself have supported? And in the same way, I'd like to put the question to you as, what have you been your failed investments as a donor? Could you possibly be critical to yourself and say, what have been your failed supports?
Sure. Well, to the first point, I think that what we are seeing in Kosovo is quite normal development of civil society. There have been, you know, with the lack of resources, it's very hard to really see rapid growth in civil society. So one of the things we're interested in also helping to promote is local philanthropy, because civil society depends on philanthropy as its kind of economic base. So this is very, very important. And
so you would like new Rockefellers of the Balkans?
Exactly. I think this would be terrific. And as people are making money in the Balkans, they should begin to give back.
How are you trying to encourage this?
Well, we are working with local partners to now bring greater awareness to philanthropy as it is developing, and we are giving awards to acknowledge really good examples of philanthropy in the Balkans. And I think this is one good step forward.
You're here for giving an award. Tonight you will be giving awards to businesses that have in some way helped the community.
Exactly.
But many people will wonder, are the businesses clean? Are you sure they don't clean the money? Are you sure they haven't earned money by avoiding taxes?
Yep.
The same issues that I think your government must have had with Rockefellers.
Exactly.
How do you ensure you're not giving awards tonight to people who have made money dodgy way?
Well, absolutely. Or that we give money to organizations that are operating in some dodgy fashion. We try to do the best we can to really examine carefully the organizations that we support or the organizations that will receive these awards. And we want to look at how open and transparent they are, because that's the greatest protection you have against making those kinds of mistakes. Now, we do make mistakes, and we have funded some things in the end that I thought didn't work as well as they should have or didn't accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. But that's all part of the process. And the key is to bring greater transparency and accountability into civil society at the same time that civil society is pushing for greater accountability and transparency in government, and it has to go hand in hand.
A lot of companies have applied for this fund, this award that you have funded, but many have a problem with the definition of what is corporate responsibility. For example, in a place where, for example, we have no legislation over what is sponsorship, what is giving the money away to community, what is giving it for free. How would you explain it? I mean, in your definition, in Rockefeller Brothers Fund definition of philanthropy, can you explain for our companies a definition of philanthropy?
Yes, and I would make a distinction between charity and philanthropy. Charity is more about giving money to provide direct help. So you see a hungry person, you provide food. And this is a very important part of giving and compassion. Philanthropy is more about changing the kind of basic conditions of society so that less people are going hungry. It's about solving the root of the problem as opposed to applying a kind of response to the problem itself or to the symptoms of the problem. So that's a very important distinction that I think we need to keep in mind. The second thing is that philanthropy needs to be conducted with the highest degree of integrity and professionalism, and that you achieve by recognizing that you have to spend money to do philanthropy well. You have to hire good people, and you have to pay them a reasonable salary so that they are operating with great integrity. And you need to do it in a way that everybody can look at and see the facts and see the numbers and see the budgets and see how the money is being spent so that you give people confidence that this is being done in an appropriate fashion.
Is philanthropy something you take credit for? Because there's been companies here that gave a lot of money, but they as well had this credited for. Like big companies had logos put everywhere. Does this still fall into philanthropy?
It can. It can. I mean, after all, our logo appears places for things that we do. I don't think that's the issue. I think that the key is the independence with which the money is used and the accountability and the transparency of the organizations that are using the money. And the corporations, if a corporation is engaging in philanthropy, it needs to be very open and transparent about it as well and show, everybody to be willing to show its books and its accounts to show that the money actually is going for philanthropic purposes.
Are you making the companies and the organizations you give money to accountable and transparent?
We do a lot to try to make that happen, but you also put your finger on something very important, which is that philanthropy and civil society will thrive when there is a really good legal environment that is established by law and regulation in the country. And that's something that Kosovo needs to do some work on, and we would be happy to help with that.
Stephen Heintz, thank you for being on Life in Kosovo.
Thank you very much, Jeta.
Në jetë, nuk ka shumë rëndësi se nga niseni, por ku shkoni dhe çfarë mund të arrini. Ne e dim shumë mirë këtë dhe mund që përkrajmë të fitoni çdo sfidë. Jeto më mirë. Raiffeisenbank.
Për ata që duan të rriten. Për ata që duan më shumë energji. Për ata që duan jetë të shëndosh. Prej gjeneratës në gjeneratë. Qumshti vita, burimi i jetës.
Cilësia e pranuar ndërkombëtarisht.
Në shtëpitë e shqiptarëve, bunari ka qenë pjesë e nevojshme për jetë. Duke u nisur nga kjo traditë, buja Ndreca ka vendosur ta merrë një iniciativë dhe të ndërtojë biblioteka në oborret e shkollës.
E kjo ide ka lindë sërit Zvicrës për me pru librin këto në vendet rurale, edhe për me javë dhonë shansën njerëzve ose fëmijëve këto në këto vende, me hap horizontin e tyne, mu informu ma shumë, edhe në jetën dinamike ku jem të jetuna me gjetë vetën ata nesër. Bunateken deri tash e kemi ndërtu e kemi realizu në 3 fshatrat Kosovës, është e para në Lutogdavt për Zrenit, e dyta është në Sfekt Klinës dhe e treta këto në Bajgore.
Ka bërë një bunatek të mirë në fshatin tonë, sepse nuk ishte bunateka në fshatin tonë deri më tash, edhe në shkollën tonë.
Biblioteka është hapë që disa javë, Dhe të gjithë nxënësit kemi tregu dëshirat tona për me lexuar libra ndryshëm, ku kemi ardhur në orët e lira dhe kemi lexuar libra të ndryshme.
Për zgjedhja e librave, na fillimisht jemi konsultuar edhe me Ministrinë e Arsimit, për të cilëve kemi marrë edhe një listë të librave, cilat libra kanë me qenë patjetër në bibliotekë, edhe bashkarisht tani me librarinë ku i kemi marrë librat, i kemi përzgjedhë domethënë librat e cikli deri në klasën e 9, plus atlase tjera, dhe me të vërtet ka libra jashtëzakonisht mira që unë sa herë t'i paloj ato nuk dilet më për asaj hapësire, se janë shumë libra të mira.
Linda në motin 1632 në qytetin e Yorkut, nga një familje e mirë. Por sot e kam marrë Robinson Crusoe, kam lexuar dhe libra të tjera si që janë tregimet e moshme shqiptare dhe Pinokjo që më ka pëlqyer për që është nga druri ai.
Tash është shumë më lehtë, tash mundem kur vim në shkollë mundem në kohët e lirë të lexojmë librat tonë të preferuar.
Për shembull kur kemi orën e edukatës fizike, pasi që tash është edhe dimër, nuk mund të dalim të bëjmë ushtrime dhe të luajmë, dhe ka një herë dal dhe pyes arsimtarët se a mund të shkojnë në bibliotekë dhe të lexojnë ndonjë libër.
Kjo është një bibliotekë që me të vërtetë është e shkëlqyeshme, sepse këtu mund gjesh edhe libra për fëmijë, mund gjesh edhe për të rritur gjuhë të huaja, fjalor, anglisht, shqip. Domthonë të gjitha llojet e libra. Dhe është një kënaqësi shumë e madhe, se jo vetëm nxënës, por këtu kemi edhe raste kur edhe studentët vijnë edhe interesohen, sepse ja student janë 50 student nga këto bjerë këtu që studiojnë dhe pse të shkojnë në Mitrovic ose në bibliotekë qytetit. Gjithashtu edhe nxënësit kanë thënë se kur ja kemi dhënë lektyrën përpara, u dashnë me bredh nëpër Mitrovic për ta gjetë lektyrën me lexu. Tani ato i kanë këtu.
Sot më bosh shumë qefi, më kanë prek shumë fëmija sot, se para disa jave kur e hapëm bunatekën, ishte sugjerimi jonë imi edhe i donatorëve që ta shfrytëzoni bunatekën.
Po, Ambasada Norvegjise ka mbështetur këtë projekt. Mendoj se është me jap mundësi fëmijëve në zonat rurale, cilët nuk kanë qasje në informata, në çfarëdo domethënë njohuri që i ndihmon atë në zhvillim personal, për me zhvillu kreativitetin, imagjinatën, nuk kanë qasje në kurrë që ndizolum krejtësisht. Mendoj që është shumë e rëndësishme që një projekt i tillë synimi jonë ka qenë që fillimisht ndihmojmë ndërtimin e këtyre 2-3 bibliotekave të para, edhe vitin tjetër do t'i bëjmë edhe 2 tjera, të paktën 2 tjera, që ma vonë ta promovojmë edhe të idejes të donatorët e tjerë, eventualisht edhe të qeveria që ky të bëhet projekt kombëtar, domethënë që t'i përfshijë gjitha shkollat rurale në gjithë Kosovën.
Pa bibliotekë, shkolla nuk mund të zhvillohet. Mësimi nuk mund të zhvillohet pa lexim. Pa kompjuter mund të zhvillohet, sepse unë besoj që libri është më herë se kompjuteri. Do thotë, po mos ishte libri, s'do të ishte as kompjuteri. Dhe gjithë ata që mendojnë se mund të arrihet vetëm me kompjuter, harrojnë se pa lexuar dhe pa lexuar as mund zhvillohet fëmiu, as mund zhvillohet shkolla, as universiteti, as fakulteti. Leximi është mbi të gjitha.
Shumë mirë, tepër mirë, për shkak se këtu në shkollë kemi pak kohë të lirë, por megjithatë atë kohë të lirë që e kemi, ne duhet ta shfrytëzojmë për gjëra të mençura, si për të lexuar libra të shumë të bukur.
Atyne që do t'u japim librat, do t'u tregojmë edhe kushtet të cilat ne i kemi caktuar kriteret, dhe nëse dëmtohet libri, ai do të blehet edhe do të zaventohet.
Dhe po sa t'i kthejnë librat, s'pari duhet t'i kthejnë ashtu siç kanë marrë të pastërta, jo të përlyme, edhe atëherë prapë do të diskutojmë së bashku secili personazh, ai personazh, dhe të shohim se sa vërtet e kanë kuptuar ata.
Na fillimisht domethënë kemi përkrahjen me letër spaku nga Ministria e Arsimit, po ashtu me letër e kemi edhe nga Drejtoria e Arsimit, edhe në Drejtoritë e Arsimit e bëjmë një marrëveshje ku ata marrin përgjegjësinë për mirëmbajtjen e bunatekës edhe aktualizimin e sajna ndërkohë, domethënë.
Po besojmë që gjithë pajtoheni se ndërtimi i kësaj biblioteke veç ja ka shtuar hije në bukurinë shalës Bajgorës. Sipas banorëve të këtij vendi, shala Bajgorës deri tash ka qenë e njohur si vendi ku bën për herë të parë bora, ka qenë i njohur si vendi që është vendi qendresës. Mirë po, këta nxënës më kanë premtuar sot që ky vend ka më u njoft si vendi ku nxënësat kanë lexuar më shumë ti. Megjithatë, po shpresojmë që gjithë bashku ju keni mirujt librat, nuk keni mi pik as me çaj as me kafe, sepse ne kemi përcjell se a urujt biblioteka e shalës Bajgorës. Unë jam Jeta për emisionin Jeta në Kosovë.